welcome to the first podcast series here at the Coping Mechanism. In this series, we explore the findings of our first survey, which looks at how people have been coping through the COVID-19 pandemic. In each episode, we are joined by experts who give us a deeper understanding into these findings, as well as an evaluation of what we might expect in the near future. I'm Malika Speaks, spoken word artist and poet, and I've been hosting these conversations. I will also give you my thoughts and conclusions at the end of the video. This episode looks at embracing change and organising the future. Our perspectives and our needs have changed as our circumstances have changed through the pandemic. The challenges presented to us with the pandemic place us in a position that made us more conscious of what we usually took for granted. It also encouraged us to think about our pre-pandemic living habits. In this episode, we consider how we embrace the changes we need to move through and beyond the pandemic in a way that brings us closer together and ensures the well-being of our society. We are joined by Nizam Uddin, co-founder of the Good Society Forum, and Daniel Mackintosh, organiser at Citizens UK. Welcome to our final podcast in this series called Embracing Change. We have with us Daniel Mackintosh, who is senior organiser and manager at Citizens UK. And we have Nizam Uddin, who works at the Prince's Trust and is the co-founder of the Good Society Forum. And of course, as ever, we have Anita Nair, social psychologist and research director here at the Coping Mechanism. So today's podcast is going to be looking at moving forward and embracing the change that our research shows that the public is hungry for. Anita, could you tell us a little bit more about what the research tells us?
Thank you, Malika Speaks. So we've got into a lot of detail in previous podcasts about how people's behaviour seems to be changing as a result of the real monumental sort of social change that's happened as a result of this pandemic, our needing to stay home, isolate, and just be very careful about our interactions. So just to recap on some of those behavioural and attitudinal changes that we've picked up in our survey, we've picked up a greater level of empathy across the board, but particularly in relation to financial well-being, with people saying that they're very conscious of either what they have or what other people don't have in comparison to them. So there's kind of greater awareness around sort of not having, and we're seeing discussions kind of picking up elsewhere outside of the survey around things like a universal basic income. We've also seen a kind of greater awareness of minority ethnic narratives, haven't we, through this? So the Black Lives Matters protest really picked up in this time. And in one of our previous podcasts, a contributor said that maybe because we've had time to stop and think. So we've been really assessing our sort of story of self as Britons, as Americans. So that's been a really big change as well. We saw also a greater appreciation, when people spoke about appreciation, a greater appreciation of being able to stop the rat race, not be so busy, and have time to think and reflect, and a real appreciation of the kind of good things that come out of having reflective spaces, people wanting to hold on to that. And with that also an appreciation of friends and family time, and kind of a move out of the shopping malls and cinema halls and into, spaces of family and friends, more around sort of parks, outdoor spaces, and just being with one another. That contentment that we saw is coming from being with one another. And this feels to be a kind of almost a newfound contentment that's sort of presented to us in comparison to the sort of happiness that you get from going shopping or going to the cinema. And then finally, we've seen this greater desire for community and togetherness. So we did a podcast, didn't we, on what we call the COVID conflict, where people are both sort of really wanting to come together, build relationships and build community actually through this and come out stronger as a community. But we're also seeing more divisions, which kind of leads us to there's a shadow side, isn't there, to all of these behavioural changes we're seeing, and attitudinal changes, which is that there's resistance to them. So we have resistance from government in terms of sort of the policy, for example, of spend to mend. That's all about getting us out again, isn't it? It's about getting us consuming again. It's about moving us away from that family contentment, more back towards a kind of consumption contentment or happiness that we get from that. It also is an encouragement of us going back into the workplace and kind of getting busy again. This kind of what Boris Johnson often refers to as a return to the normal, or as normal as we can get. to paraphrase. So that's kind of a shadow side. That's a resistance to some of the types of change that we've been experiencing and enjoying. And also we've seen kind of a resistance to changes to narrative of self. So all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter, for example. And then we've seen some kind of more divisive narratives as well around race. So where we've lent into community and togetherness, we've also seen a sort of much higher rate of fines against ethnic minorities for breaking the rules, and that came through in our survey as well, didn't it? That ethnic minorities are more likely to say they've been reminded of the rules than the white majority group. So there is a resistance to this change as well. So I'm really interested in having Nizam and Daniel here today, who are both sort of organisers, work in that world of integration. They're real doers, and I'm really interested in seeing how they found the change in the work they've been doing, and how they feel about embracing positive change and protecting that from resistance.
Thank you, Anita. Nizam, I'm going to turn to you first. Have you noticed change, or what changes have you noticed in our behaviour through your work in the pandemic?
Thank you. So I'm going to use the Good Society Forum, which is something that we created at the start of the pandemic quite early on, where we have addressed a range of topics from health on the front lines through to education, through to food systems, to really understand exactly this question, which is how are people dealing with the pandemic and trying to innovate, trying to come up with solutions to what is effectively this unprecedented, and we keep hearing this word unprecedented, set of issues. And I'm going to use the example of food in terms of behavior. And I know Anita has mentioned it briefly, but there's a lovely panelist that we had, Jose Luis Chicoma, who summarized it best. He said, we are related in some ways that we haven't been related for years. And he used that as a description of what this pandemic has done to us as individuals in terms of our behavior. So we heard about the emboldened empathy that Anita mentioned. There's also an innate curiosity, which our daily lives, living that rat race, living that life where we are living by our day-to-day timetable, getting up on time, going to work, whatever our routines might be, that we forget to maybe combine that empathy with that curiosity. So people are now asking more questions using the example of food as to where their food is coming from. When you're in lockdown, there are measures now being taken for people to think about, where's this food being prepared? You're thinking about your own food, because suddenly you're going to have to make food 3 times a day potentially. You're thinking about the types of nutrition you're using. You're really enabling a renewed relationship, if you will, with something that actually you've probably just gotten used to, possibly even started to neglect in terms of your daily relationship with. And then beyond that, we're starting to think about who is having to go into work so that we can all eat, for example. We're thinking about production factories. We heard in America, some of the biggest places where COVID was spread was these huge factories where a lot of, unfortunately, immigrants in particular were having to go to, or low-paid workers were having to go to. And again, that enable this disproportionality of COVID being hit on ethnic minority communities. So it's really enabled us to have a combination of curiosity, because suddenly we were able to take a step back and really think about every element of our lives. It made us think about, where was our food coming from, if I use the example of food. And even when we're on the odd occasion, because we all couldn't afford to buy food all the time because we were at home, we may have used a Uber Eats, for example, and when the food was coming, we're thinking about who's delivering that to us. And so we had this emboldened empathy. And I think in the UK, what we saw was a formal recognition of that, because suddenly, historically, key workers was never going to be someone that we thought of as an Uber driver or somebody who is at a checkout in a supermarket. And suddenly we not only had them in our minds, in the front of our minds as key workers, but it was formalized by government. Government formally recognized key workers as key workers. So, in terms of our behavior, I think what we were able to do was a combination of taking that break, the great reset, as everybody's calling it, where we're forced to really look into ourselves and be curious about things that we probably took for granted. And I think that is an incredible feat for all of us, because historically, well, I say historically, in recent history, when we're asked to make change, we keep thinking, oh, that's not possible because of XYZ, whereas now we took that break. And then I would say that emboldened empathy. So I mean, I'll stop there, but I think those are the main behaviors that I've certainly noticed, in terms of, or two of the main behaviors that I've noticed, and I'm sure there are more which I can speak about. I'm keen to hear what Daniel has to say.
I really like the term emboldened empathy, and I think, Anita, you'd agree as well that we definitely felt a sense of that through our results. Daniel, I wanted to ask you, because when we've spoken previously, you mentioned that when we kind of met with the pandemic, you expected that you would see a decrease in your work, because of the nature of your work with, communities coming together. But then you kind of learned that actually, it didn't work out that way. If anything, that, there was more things happening. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
I think initially, I think not alone. The first couple of weeks were flapping, trying to pretend that I was working by going on as many Zoom calls as I could manage, feeling, oh yes, I've done my 9 to 5. But actually, I had. It's interesting what Anna was saying, the importance of moving away from happiness through transaction to trying to be whole people. Where people are trying to take stock of their lives and reflect on real priorities. So as an organizer, I have to have 15 one-on-one conversations with new people a week. That's stock standard organizing. And I found I had really, really rich conversations with people who weren't just thinking about the next week, the next 2 months. We're really thinking actually, where am I going? Where do I want to take my life? Where do I want to take my community? So the kinds of responses that I saw were around lots of people joining current institutions. A number of faith institutions in our membership saw huge amounts of deepening participation, including the new synagogue that I'm helping to create. And then, because faith institutions are encourage time for reflection, that was kind of built in. So people, were using some of this time. Okay, it was on Zoom. It's not the same as being in the building, etc. But that's one. So people were joining, or they were trying to set up new institutions. So the kind of mutual aid movement, which was is really interesting. One day we'll see all kinds of studies around what that was like, what happened. But one of the risks of the mutual aid. Just what's happened on my estate, as I live in an estate in South London. So there was a huge stage 1 was burst of energy, go, crisis, lots of WhatsApp messages, going all hours and night. Stage 2 is tiredness. So as the mutual aid groups basically over time started to degrade. And stage 3 is exhaustion and withdrawal. I think now one of the deep questions is what can we build that will be sustainable and persist beyond the initial energy and then the withdrawal.
Interesting. Actually, on the back of that, what do you expect will happen next?
Some of the risks are job loss, anger, and a sense of powerlessness and lethargy. I think that's potentially one set of things that could happen. And my real worry is about the challenge right now, and the risks to democratic life as we retreat from the public square. So there's this great piece written by Corey Robin in the New York Review of Books. And I'm not smart enough to remember quotes, but I wrote this down because I wanted to share it in this. And he says, tyrants, the tradition of political theory teaches us, thrive on the separation of citizens from one another. Maximizing space between people clears the public square of all potential opposition and resistance. It is what allows the despot to swing his sword with such abandon. Those are quite prophetic words. But the truth is, with all those risks, actually, I think what I can see starting to happen is a democratic participatory flowering. And there's a huge amount of organizing happening. We've won things in the last 3 months that I don't think we ever thought we would be able to. And there's a huge amount of energy because I think people have not just started to dream of a different world, can actually imagine what that could feel like. They've had a little taste. And I think that's new. It makes people hungry. So it's a fun time to be an organizer.
That really resonates.
Actually, Anita, I'll come back to you, but Nizam, just based on what you spoke about emboldened empathy, bearing that in mind, what do you think will happen next, or how will we carry that forward?
It's a really good question. I think it's the $1 million question for all of us. I mean, a bit like what Daniel was saying, I think in terms of what I expect to happen is what we're seeing happen at the moment, which is a understanding of this systemic way in which we live our lives, which is a transactional one, where, I think what's interesting is to think about the way in which we were conditioned to understandably think about the coronavirus, and to think about our responsibility to each other, and specifically our responsibility to our National Health Service. And so we had all of this, which I'm sure your research shows, we were effectively told to look after this, to be scared effectively, and to be fearful, and to protect those people around us, those that we love. So we did. All of us, we stayed at home, as all the jokes that we make, the kids turned to the parents, and we suddenly started policing our parents, and we started asking them, where are you going? When are you going to be home? What's going on? And we need you home at this time. And, they were the ones who were being a bit flippant, and it was interesting, right? And I've had this conversation so many times with friends. And then now suddenly we are being asked to do the very thing that we thought we wouldn't be doing for at least another 6 months, which is to go back into the city square, to go back into town centers, because the shops aren't being utilized. And so my fear is, in terms of what I expect to happen, is probably a language which is for us to go back to normal. And normal is pre-COVID normal, but people have fundamentally changed. And so I think what we have to do is embrace this new normal that each and every one of us has experienced in our own way, through our own idiosyncratic context, through our own family, our loved ones, whatever it might be. And so what we have to do at an individual level is accept that there's a new normal for us, that we have new sense of expectation, goalposts about who we are. I now like my 1 hour walk a day. I never had time for that. I want to maintain that, whatever happens. And so how I need to maintain that. And so how does that then fit into the jigsaw of how I am as a member of society, how I am as a member of my immediate workplace and my organization? And so I think what we're going to see is a reviewing and a renewing of the social contract. Between people and the state, between people and the workplace, between people and community organizations. And I think we have to be open to that. And I think there's going to be a lot more gray and a lot more murkiness and a lot more figuring out, because I don't think it's so simple. And I think that has to be allowed. I think we have to facilitate and be okay with not knowing for a while, because we are shifting from what we were to what we are now and what we're going to be. And I think that's really, really important. And I think that emboldened empathy can carry us forward. My worry is that we will be tempted, because of the systems around us, how they operate and how they work, to go back to a place where many of us were in a rat race, where we lived in no control of our own destiny day to day. And I don't mean anybody was controlling us, but just by virtue of our circumstances, whether it's paying bills, what time to catch a train, that pack movement. And it's interesting now, right? In terms of schools going back, in terms of people going back, we are actually disrupting. So I do think what's going to happen now, if I look at a schools context, and I work with young people in my daily life, you now have schools opening, but schools are having to stagger the entry times for young people going in. So the notion of peak time, that it's a problem. Whereas actually that was the definition of the problem that we had, right? We peaked and we troughed every day. There was a rush hour and there was a rush hour. And we were fighting to get to the start or the end of rush hour, but we were all part of the rush hour. Whereas now the rush hour is the problem. And it's really symptomatic of societally the issues that we're dealing with, right? And so I think interestingly there are some unique opportunities coming right now, just not in terms of maintaining the balances that many of us have been forced to almost achieve in this time, but actually for us to survive and for us to maintain some semblance of normalcy, to ensure that we don't have another spike and another spike and another spike. We're going to have to live very differently. And that, I think, is going to be forced upon us, and that's a good thing. And so I think we should embrace it as a good thing.
Yeah, it makes me think, like, re-understanding, like, what is a healthy human. Like, that's, I think, going to be part of our collective work. Like, and I think that's so interesting.
It's really interesting. And I think as well, what you were talking about, Nizam, as, as in the world of psychology, and in previous podcasts, we've referred to this as post-traumatic growth, right? So when trauma happens, which we define as a big change in your life, so this rupture from the past happens, you find ways to cope. And those new behaviors you develop to cope, if they're healthy for you and good for you, you retain them and you grow as a person. So we become stronger individuals emotionally as a result of trauma, what we can do, right? So there are many ways to do that, and that kind of the realization that there is uncertainty, that's one way you can do it. Reliance on others is another way you can do it. And just stopping to think, like, actually, I need that run every day, and maintaining those sorts of behaviors. You've grown, right? You've grown as a person. You're doing something that's really healthy for you physically and psychologically. And actually, I feel that puts us in a very good place to maintain the behaviors that we've experienced as positive for us, to grow as individuals and as a community. And I'm also concerned about the sort of what I was calling the shadow side, like the pressure to do the opposite of what we feel is good for us. Because I think that I can see the potential there of increasing sort of distress and anxiety, because now we've experienced something, we've grown emotionally, and now we're being told to stop the behaviours that have helped us to grow. That's quite a difficult ask. And I think we need to be ready as community spaces to kind of support people to lean into what they prioritize themselves, right? That's like that psychological resilience right there, is I'm going to lean into what I know is good for me, and I'm going to organize my life that way.
Can I offer like a different perspective? Because I'm a little bit more worried than Anita is. Because I think that alone we're not powerful enough to resist all of these forces. Capitalism, it's all too strong for us, I think, by ourselves. And I think that's where, like, the role of the institution can come in, the role of the institution that we're a part of. So we talk about how institutions can help to protect us from the excesses and the pressures, because when we're part of a community and we talk about these things and then we resist, for me, I'm a Jewish boy, like the Sabbath is a brilliant example. It's a time where I say, nope, the world, my job, my phone, not allowed. There's a boundary. But it's too hard to do alone. I've got to do that as part of a community. So, and then our institutions can help to kind of fortify us to be able to be strong enough to do that, and then be able to support us to be able to, resist some of those pressures, and then also be able to support us with, like many of the faith communities I'm connected with through my organizing, like they are creating hardship funds. So they're actually literally helping people to rebuild their lives, and helping people to connect with other people, with others, to have enough power to win and embed the change that we've seen as possible now. Anyway, I don't know what other people think about that, but
I completely agree. And yeah, I didn't mean to say that the change happens alone. It can't happen alone. So I think it's really important to point out the importance of community. And again, like when we look at how people build resilience to trauma, relationship building, which is what I've been talking about, like that is crucial to it. That's how people come out of trauma, because we create a new sense of self together. You're right, you can't do that alone.
I think everything that you're saying actually leads to the question, how do organizations and institutions support and embrace this change?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is recognize that they already have. I think organizations have changed. They've had to embrace change. We've had 4 months of absolute shift in how we operate, depending on what the organization is. And most organizations they've had zero choice but to pivot and to shift and to operate in a new way, in a new model. So I think the first thing is to recognize what that looks like. And I think what organizations shouldn't do is to see this period as, oh, we just had to do something which is different to what we were doing before, and we need to now go back to what we were doing before. But rather actually think about what they did overnight. So the organizations I'm a part of, whether it's the Princess Trust and others, what we had to do overnight is shut down our buildings. And, we are there for young people. We support young people who are disproportionately affected by a lockdown. They're disproportionately affected by furlough schemes because young people generally are in jobs which are more insecure and lower down the ladder. And so they are the ones who are going to be furloughed. Young people were affected by schools, obviously. And so suddenly here we are, we're usually a helpline for young people. And suddenly we had to shift everything because our physical buildings were closed and we had to go online. And I think, there's a really funny joke, which I'm sure many of you have seen, which is the CTO, the chief whatever officer for years hasn't been able to digitize a company. And then you've had, COVID, and they use some COVID abbreviation to say, and COVID overnight has digitized the whole country. Because every one of us has had to pivot overnight. So not just that, but also actually then what we did as an organization very quickly, and we saw this, I've seen this in many organizations, because everybody suddenly went online at the same time together, the one thing that we all enjoyed doing were having tea together at a certain point, right? We enjoyed that communal being together in an office. So we recreated that. Like one of the funniest things I saw in the first week of lockdown was colleagues created a virtual pub on Teams where they would go hang out after work, and then there was a non-alcoholic version in somewhere else. And so in terms of leaning and embracing change, I think I would say it's happened. I think organizations are already there. So I think recognize what you have already achieved, and that's your new foundation in terms of moving forward, and also celebrating their own personnel for being supremely adaptive, right? All of us overnight had to change our mode of being, the way we were with each other. I'm sure it's interesting for me on a deeply personal level. It was really interesting to really think about intentionally, who did I want to spend time with? Because that was interesting. As somebody who lives in London, who is out and about every day, and my work is meeting people, there were people who I met because I met them. If somebody came up to you and said, "Hey, let's grab coffee," you would never say no, because as Daniel knows now, I trained as an organizer years back, and so any opportunity of a one-to-one, you say yes to. Suddenly, that was gone out the window because I'm tired. Zoom, there's an opportunity cost, and so you end up spending high-quality time with particular people. We changed the way we worked, we changed the way we studied, we changed the way we love. Right? Suddenly, if there's vulnerable people in your family, you are probably spending more time on video calls with them and spending time with them. So, in terms of how can organizations lead in and embrace change, that's practical things I'm sure I could mention, but I think the most important thing to mention, culturally, practically, they've already done it. And I think that's the thing to remember the most. They've done it and they can continue it, should they choose to do so. And that's the point. It's a choice.
Daniel, as Nizam highlighted, and you did previously as well, we've obviously really changed the way in which we work. How do institutions move forward with working with each other and connecting with each other?
The kind of work that I do is we build these civil society alliances that are purposefully diverse, that are purposefully permanent, and that at the heart of them encourage people to build relationships with one another. And I think that's the real risk, and that's also kind of what I suppose it is, this hinting at, that we could end up just building relationships with ourselves, the people just closest to us. And so how do we create structures where we break that intentionally? We call it disorganizing and reorganizing. How do we intentionally go out there? I like to ask organizations the question, how could you be the most well-connected institution in a 1 mile radius? What are you going to do about that? You care about that? Interested in that? What are you going to do? How are you going to connect to other people? Otherwise, there is this risk that the lockdown is just going to narrow us. So for me, the key way of doing that is to create permanent organizations of organizations. where,
Can I?
yeah.
No, I was just going to reflect back to you, like the question you asked earlier, which is what can we do that will be sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'd answer it like slightly similarly. Like for me, this is about creating long-term ways where people can relate and connect with one another, regardless of institution. And it really can be online. I think that is possible. Even if we have to distance for the next year, it is still possible for people to build relationships across different types of institutions.
Are there any existing examples of that?
Yeah, I mean, so I thought a little bit about. Can I go back to the question about how institutions can lean in and embrace change? Because I've got just one thought on that. I think so. I definitely agree with Nizam about the changes already happened, and then now it's about how do we embed that. And I think that there is still soil to prepare, groundwork to do, because my experience is that it depends on the culture of an institution and what the culture is, and that what's the culture that institution is seeking to create. So in organizing, we talk about the difference between a maintenance culture, which is a culture where it seeks to ensure that things stay the same and focus on people's needs, like a sports club. Like, how do we deliver to people's needs? In comparison to what we are trying to build as organizers, which is a relational culture, a culture that focuses primarily on building relationships and developing people and seeking to draw out people's gifts and talents and creating a culture of responsible risk-taking. And I think that requires work. To really build a relational culture, and often that's why people seek organizers, because organizers are kind of coaches, agitators, people who are saying, how do you build and rebuild this institution to focus on the right things? So I think that's the kind of things that organizations can try and embrace internally, and then externally, that's where I come to the question that you two kind of posed, which is about, like, none of us can make change alone. Organizing teaches us to join together into these permanent alliances where the sum is greater than its parts.
Can I very quickly just on that, in terms of how we make it easy for people to create and maintain change? I'm a really big believer in role modeling. A surprise, I'm part of a mentoring entity, and I think the power of celebrating success is crucially important, and the power of celebrating. I think the power of celebrating enables conditions to normalize and conditions to continue. So the way in which we create and maintain change is by celebrating those who have changed, and celebrate it in a manner that is befitting of the circumstance. Because change isn't easy, right? I mean, then I've had this conversation many times with many people during the pandemic, which is who are my friends with kids are like, who are these people who are like, oh, I'm going to learn a new language during the pandemic, why don't they have things to do? Then I have friends equally who are like, I'm going to go learn a language, right? And so circumstances are hugely different, and so we have to represent the full diversity of people and their circumstance, because when we're looking to maintain change, what we are always looking for in these types of situations, if you're a young person, is something that you can see yourself in. And if you don't see yourself in that ability to change, you're not going to want to change, because you're going to think you're stuck in your circumstance, wherever it might be. And I think one of the ways in which we continue to embrace change is to continue celebrating very different circumstances of individuals and communities and partnerships and alliances and what we've heard so far, and celebrating them. And I think that is part of the changing the conditions of people realizing that they can permanently change. So it sounds very basic, but I do fundamentally believe in the power of the narrative, right? Which is so crucial. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think that is important.
Agreed. Thank you, Nizam. So finally, Daniel, what would be your 3 golden rules for organizations who are trying to make positive change?
I'm going to answer like an organizer, so please excuse me. Number 1 is the iron rule: never, ever do for others what they can do for themselves. That's the golden rule for my tradition of all organizing. It is a way that we don't patronize people, and even people who are powerless or poor or wherever. Like, everybody's got a degree of agency. So how do we not act for people, but create spaces where people can act themselves? And recognizing people's like relative power, differential, means that people have a different amount of agency, but everyone's got it. So that's number one. Two is to focus on people before program. So too often we assume what people's interests are based on the demographics or where they live or like how old they are or what ethnic community or what's their religious, blah, 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 blah. And then we go out and try and solve problems for them. But actually the more powerful opportunities to listen to people and help them to articulate like what are the things that they care about. And institutions can be really, really good at this or really, really bad at this. And then involve them in whatever the answers are going to be. So that's number two. And number three is don't do it alone. So coming back to that question of how can you be the best networked organization in your area? And then how do you get the training and set up a permanent structure to allow you to win and create change again and again and again and again?
Okay, so Nizam, what would be your 3 golden rules for organizations who are trying to make a positive change through this pandemic?
Okay, so I think obviously there's loads. I'm going to try and stick to 3. My first one is going to be around, so I think a recognition firstly, and I think it's important to note this, which is what the pandemic has done is shone a spotlight on existing inequality. So when organizations are trying to make positive change, the change isn't new because of the pandemic. The change happened and existed long before the pandemic. And what the pandemic has done is created some conditions for people to really see it all at once, partly because we have a higher attention now because we're at home, and partly because of the fact that we've seen issues be raised because of the circumstance of lockdown. So the first important thing is to find systemic and sustainable ways to ensure the user voice, the lived experience, however you want to phrase it, is at the heart of the organization, because by doing that, organizations are going to future-proof their impact on the issues that they are designed to solve. So I think that's really, really important. 2 is going to be around, especially given what the pandemic has done, is we have gotten so used to dealing with the symptoms of a problem. So it could be unemployment, it could be issues of racism, it could be issues of food poverty, that now we have an opportunity to move away from addressing the symptoms to start addressing some of the systemic structural problems of a whole array of issues. And organizations should try and make that pivot. They should try and think about how, when they now do their business planning around what the future of their organization looks like, that's what they should do. And the third is a really basic one, which is, I think there's going to be a temptation. There was a temptation at the beginning of the pandemic. It's true British, right? Like, which is we have a stiff upper lip, we stay calm and we carry on. And that actually is not necessarily the right approach. And the reason why I say that is because by saying, oh, this is just a blip in the matrix, we're going to continue as normal after this is all over, is not something that we actually want to be advocating. I think what we want to say is something along the lines of, this is a change that has happened. It's quite significant, and businesses and organizations should embrace that this huge thing has happened. Because I already know that there are some organizations who are like, well, we've made contingency for this thing to happen. Once it's over, we're just going to go back to the way we were. And that's part of the problem. We don't want that, right? And so I think organizations should really start considering shifting the mechanisms that drive them day to day. And those mechanisms might be a business plan, it might be a strategy, whatever it might be. And as you can tell by my language, I over the course of my career have shifted from the day-to-day nitty-gritty to really thinking about what drives organizations day to day. And what drives them often is funding, it's communications, it's marketing, it's PR, it's the founder, and it's very rarely, that's what Daniel said earlier, right? People over programs. I think that that's something really, really important. And the way to do that is for us to really embrace the context and the situation that we find ourselves in. So those are the three I would say right now, given a global pandemic.
So just very quickly, what are or where are some examples of people creating change?
I think this is the most important question, and the reason for that is I think we have seen an incredible amount of energy and activity and action from incredible actors who've really gone about their daily lives. And again, the one thing I would really just emphasize is what we have seen with the pandemic is there are people who were doing incredible work before, and their work was highlighted. Right? We talked about the key workers, we talked about the nurses, we talked about frontline workers. I mean, there's a few examples I'd love to give, which have come out of the Good Society Forum, which we try and celebrate different actors in different parts of systems. So we have seen it right across a spectrum of society and change makers at the very, very local level. If I give you the example of New Haven in Connecticut, you had an incredible restaurant. So like across in the UK, we had restaurants which were shut down overnight, but you had 22 restaurants in the local area who founded something called Frontline Foods New Haven, which was a collaborative that provided over 26,000 meals to the city's frontline workers, which addressed the problem both in the local supply chain during lockdown, because they needed income to survive, as well as addressing the issues of those frontline key workers having to be, who were vulnerable, right, in terms of being exposed to COVID. So that's a really good example. Another example was in Freetown, Sierra Leone, where Mayor Yvonne Akisoya, and Freetown is the most densely populated city in Sierra Leone. So the idea of enforcing a 2-meter social distancing rule, which in places, even in the UK, is difficult, was incredibly hard because people lived in slum communities. 35%, I think, of the city lived in slum communities with access to food being a daily struggle. Literally, people had enough money to go and pay for their food. And some of the amazing work that they did was actually created, and they kickstarted. So they used the opportunity to kickstart urban farming to ensure future food sustainability. Now, that is a problem that existed before COVID, but COVID provided an opportunity to deal with it. One other example I want to give, because I think globally we've seen this, is in Somalia. You had Dr. Deko Mohammed, who is a doctor and founder of an amazing institute, who was on the front lines of dealing with COVID. And one of the things that she told us was, we asked her, how are you feeling? And she had this big smile on her face. And we're like, hey, what's going on? She's like, I am now able to make systemic change in health infrastructure that I haven't been able to for a decade beforehand. And so it provided an opportunity to make change. And so I think what's interesting here is the impact of COVID and the pandemic on existing fault lines of inequality is really worth highlighting, because not only has that been a huge issue in terms of impact on particular communities, but it's also really allowed change to be made. And obviously what we've seen in terms of in the UK, right across the country, is the way local communities have come together. We heard of what Daniel mentioned in terms of local entities creating WhatsApp groups and supporting each other. We've also all come together once a week to clap for our nurses and our doctors and our key workers. We've locally self-organized. We've created mutual supports of help to our most vulnerable neighbors. And I think what it's really shown us is actually that the potential for positive relationships between different groups in society, and that in terms of a new social contract with each other, I think is probably the single most positive thing that I've taken away from the pandemic, and hope that we can build on and continue.
Okay, thank you so much for your really insightful contributions to this podcast. What stands out to me the most in this discussion is this new emboldened empathy, as well as the recognition that people are feeling closer than ever to a more healthier and positive way of living. These are key elements in driving the change we need towards a more positive and cohesive society. I truly believe in our collective power, and although we are in a time of turbulence and trial, reforming for the better feels closer than ever. If you have any thoughts or questions, please do leave them in the comments. Thank you for joining us here at The Coping Mechanism, and we look forward to welcoming you next time.
quickly, like, what is Citizens UK? So I'm happy to just say for a second what it is, because I just think sometimes it's very, I mean, to be honest, my mother, I've been doing this for 7 years, my mother still can't understand what I do. But Citizens, it's an alliance of 450 civil society organizations in 12 cities, including faith, education, charity, union, with 500,000 people in the membership. And what we do is we train people in how to win campaigns, build campaigns. So the living wage is, one of our most famous. And specifically as an organizer, my role is to train the people within those organizations on how do they connect with one another and then build alliances with other organizations to win collectively. And the key thing that we teach is the methodology of organizing, which comes from the Highlander School in the US that trained Martin Luther King and Ella Baker and Bayard Rustin to rebuild people's sense of collective power, to moving from powerlessness to powerful. You can find out more about Citizens UK at www.citizensuk.org.